Good morning, everyone. Hello, sunshines. Left in the book completely, which feels like would this day ever come? We have done a whole lot since August, so we only have, I think, like I said, 3 chapters left, if I remember right. Let me make sure. We just finished 38, so we have 39, 40. I'm 41. Yeah, we only have 3 chapters left. Wild. So a few things I want to mention before I get into the review stuff. One is you should have seen a couple of things I want to point out on Canvas. One is that you have a project that is due when we come back from break. So Tuesday when you're back online. So make sure that was posted on Monday. So make sure that if you haven't looked at that, you do look at that so that you can work on that over the weekend. But of course, you don't have to wait until Tuesday to post your project. You can post it immediately. If you saw it on Monday and you're already done, go ahead and upload it. You don't have to wait. In addition to that, what else? You have a DBQ today. I've already, as I sent the reminder yesterday, I already gave everyone feedback on their contextualization. Overall, it looks like we still need more practice. So we're going to be doing more practice on contextualization. Several people rewrote one of the ones that they didn't get and then sent it back to me to let them know if that was better. And that was great. If more of you want to do that, feel free. Absolutely. You can just type in a Word document, text it to me, email it to me. I don't care. But you should have seen, I did upload 4 examples that I wrote. I wrote a contextualization paragraph for each one of those prompts that you did. I wrote one. So hopefully you can see the differences between, like, if I told you, like, you were spot on or you started good and then drifted away. Hopefully you can see in my example where you sort of went wrong. For the most part, people started right, and everyone just started with, like, before year blah blah blah. That's a really lazy, crappy way to begin your, like, entire essay. So I don't recommend that. As you saw in my examples, I don't do that one time. That's unnecessary. You don't need to say, hey, here I am contextualizing. It's okay if you do that. You're not going to lose a point for it, but it's just not great writing. So at least when you go to college, please don't do that. But the other major issue was that people were still using information that they're going to use in their argument. If the essay question, the first one, which is asking you to evaluate how the television has affected politics since 1950, you don't need to mention the television before the end, right? Because if you're giving me context with the previous period, then you don't need to talk about television because you're in the previous period when the television was not popular. Yes, the television could have been invented before then, but that doesn't mean anything, right? Like, the car was invented in the 1800s, but it isn't relevant until we get to the later early 1900s. So try to remember that. And even when the car first becomes popular with Henry Ford, it takes on a new scale in the 1950s. So make sure that you're being careful and not, if anything that you write in your contextualization paragraph, almost a paragraph, if any of it is relevant to your argument, like if any of it is something that you would want to say later in your argument, like the television helped Kennedy get elected, that does not go in your contextualization. That is evidence for your argument. If you want to talk about televising presidential debates, that's a great example, but that is part of your argument. That's not part of your contextualization. So if you need more help, definitely let me know. If you feel like you need one-on-one time, I can schedule a conference with you and we can do that. If you want me to everyone should have plenty of old examples of DBQs and stuff in your notebook. But if for some reason you don't have your notebook, I know there are like 3 people who left their notebooks at school and never got them, which they were not supposed to do. You were supposed to go get them when I told you to. But nevertheless, if your notebook is still at school and so you don't have those examples, ask someone to take a picture of one, or you can ask me and I can email you some College Board released sample ones. So as we move through this and start to get, fine all our DBQ skills, we'll look at a lot more examples, and we'll do this 100 more times. So you'll feel more comfortable by the time we get to the DBQ, because ultimately the goal is, by the time we get to the exam, for out of those 10 points, for you to have some type of recipe ready, to be able to get enough out of those 10 points to pass. And so, not everybody has to make a perfect score, right? That's not necessarily the goal. The goal is to get enough to pass. And context and thesis statements are the 2 easiest points to get, or at least they should be. So, so those need to be our first 2 priorities. Yesterday, you should have seen that you had some thesis statements to practice on. So I will look at those today and I'll give you some feedback. But it's okay if I haven't done that yet. You can still work on the Vietnam DBQ that you have. You don't have to wait for me. Fun fact, the DBQ that you're working on today is the DBQ that I had to write when I took AP US History in high school. Of course, I changed the wording of the question because the wording has changed a lot in the past 12 years. So I reworded the question to match like the current College Board, like prompting verbiage. And I also took out like 4 documents, and it's on Vietnam, which should be, fresh in everyone's mind. And remember, while you're doing all this DBQ practice, whether it's your thesis, your contextualization, or writing the whole essay, use your notes, use your book. Don't feel like you have to, all the information has to come from your head, because on the exam, you can get all that done in 45 minutes. That's really going to help you once it comes time for the actual exam to happen. So, all right, I think that's all I have as far as announcements go. Project, context, thesis, DBQ today. That's all I can think of. As a reminder, you don't have any work tomorrow because tomorrow's a teacher work day. You don't have any work Friday because Friday's a holiday. And you don't have any work Monday because Monday's a teacher work day. So feel free to catch up on all the AP Lang work that you're behind on, because I keep hearing from everyone that they're behind on AP Lang work. And feel free to knock out that coronavirus project that I gave you. Oh, and maybe I'll upload the movie list I keep forgetting to do. Maybe I'll upload that this afternoon and you can watch a movie on something. Of course you have a quiz today, Maddie. Why do you think we're doing this review? Yes, you have a quiz today. The quiz is ready. I'll publish it as soon as we're done with this. All right, so I'm going to go through the bold that's in your book, but as I'm going through that, if you have questions about anything, type it in the live chat and I'll address it as I get to it. But don't forget, as usual, there's a lag. It might take me a few seconds. All right. Stagflation, I do believe I hit on actually in the last chapter, but the book fleshes it out more here because it's more of a 70s issue than a 60s issue, and your book really goes chronologically. How do you get the same font on the posters? You mean for the project? I don't know. It doesn't have to be the exact same font. I'm sure you could just play enough with Microsoft Publisher or something. And a good app for poster making is called Canva, Canva. Let me show it to you. It's like this that little blue C right there. That is a good app to use. It's got like poster templates and stuff. And you can use it on a computer or on your phone. It doesn't matter. But like you just type in that you want to make a poster. And then it's got all these like templates and stuff. And you just like pick a template. And then you can like change the font, change your picture, whatever. So they've got more fonts on there. If doing it on Publisher or Word is not for you, you've got plenty of days to play with it online and figure out what works for you. Anyway, so stagflation. This is when we see inflation and stagnant economic growth happening at the same time. Remember, normally when inflation is occurring at a moderate rate, which is normal, there's also economic growth coupled with it. So as the cost of living rises, typically so does average income rise. So they match. So you don't necessarily feel the burden of rising prices because you're also making more money. So it generally, levels out. That's one of the reasons why hyperinflation is so dangerous, because inflation's happening so quickly that even if economic growth is rising, it's not rising fast enough to match the hyperinflation. That's when you get into, like circumstances when money is no longer, worth anything. So, stagflation is not as severe, obviously, as hyperinflation, but it is definitely a problem, and it's more of a long problem. Seeing, the same amount of economic growth that you're seeing inflation. And so because of that, they don't match, they're not mirroring each other. And so you do feel the burden of any type of like economic, ooh, my hair is getting crazy, any type of like economic growth or anything like that. You feel the burden of the rising prices. Could that happen now? Yeah, absolutely. It could happen now. Venezuela's been in the middle of a hyperinflation situation for a year, 2 years. I think just last year, their inflation rate was over 1,000,000%, something ridiculous. So absolutely, it could still happen. Could happen at any time. Just more of the like impending doom. That's hilarious. I hope that she doesn't find any, or do I hope she finds some? Hard to say. So stagflation we're going to be dealing with throughout all of the 1970s. And the reasons I talked about is, Vietnam War debt is a problem. The oil crisis is a problem. Paul Volcker's high interest rates are going to help a little bit, and then they'll make things worse. So it's one thing after another. One problem after another is going to lead us down this road. Watergate, I think, was in the first video for this entire chapter. So that was where the DNC got broken into in DC, and the guys that did it ended up working for Nixon. They do this whole investigation. They basically accused Nixon of not necessarily ordering the break-in, but at least trying to cover up the break-in. And so the Senate asks for tape recordings of Nixon's office, of the conversations held in the Oval Office. He refuses. He claims that those tapes are part of executive privilege, which is essentially like the president's right to privacy. And he refuses to give those up. Congress sues Nixon for the tapes, so the Supreme Court has to now make the decision, and they decide the tapes are not part of executive privilege. He has to give up the tapes, and in some of the tapes, there's deleted portions. It just goes silent, and then in one tape in particular, you hear Nixon saying to his aides to stave off an FBI investigation, and it makes it seem right there like he's straight up involved in the cover-up. So they get ready to impeach him, but before they can actually do so, he resigns so that he's not labeled as an impeached president. And so after that, Gerald Ford becomes president. So overwhelmingly, no one really suspects Nixon of being involved in the order of the break-in, but there's pretty much a unanimous consensus that Nixon was guilty for trying to cover it up, so as it wouldn't hurt his political campaign. And it worked at the time, right? It didn't really come up in the 1972 election. It won't really blow up in his face for another year and a half after that. The smoking gun tape is that tape that where on the tape Nixon saying, don't let the FBI get in my business. And Congress is like, why don't you want the FBI in your business, sir? The ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, that was the amendment that was supposed to, Miss Marshall's texting me. That was the amendment where you're supposed to, say people are going to be treated equally regardless of race, gender, yada, yada, yada. And it passes in Congress. And then unfortunately doesn't get enough states to ratify it. But that was like one of the big goals of the women's liberation movement through the 1970s. So it was successful in Congress, not successful on a state ratification basis. Roe v. Wade, that was the Supreme Court case that determined that a woman's right, basically a woman has a complete control over her own reproductive rights. So a woman has a right to choose an abortion in the first trimester, second trimester. It's up to the state, third trimester, medical emergency only. The new right is not, I know your book mentions it in here, but it's not really relevant in this chapter. And it's more relevant once we get to Reagan's election and how Reagan gets elected. So even though the new right is in this chapter, I'm not going to ask you about the new right in this quiz or in this test next week. You don't need to worry about the new right until the last period. That'll be like the first thing we talk about in period 9 is going to be the new right. But essentially the new right is this new rise in conservatism. I mentioned it when I talked about televangelists and how that was one of the ways that Jimmy Carter got elected. So the new right is what is relevant in that way. The Christian side of that movement helps get Jimmy Carter the job, but there's a lot more new right groups other than just evangelicals. There's neocons and sagebrush rebels and all these other groups, and we'll talk about them in period 9. The Malaise speech was just like, I'm not going to ask you about that. That's one of, it's like one of the last speeches Jimmy Carter gave when he was president. It was pretty much like the nail in his coffin in terms of re-election, because he basically just like went in on the American people and was like, y'all are getting way too caught up in material things. You're not like focusing on the right, basically like criticizing people for criticizing his foreign policy philosophy and things like that. And then like the next day after this speech, he like fired half of his cabinet and tried to go through this whole, transition thing. But by that point, it was like people were really starting to question, like, what kind of a leader is Jimmy Carter? So if anything, that was something that just like made him look really bad. SALT II was the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty or talks. So remember, one was signed by Ford and then done away with, and then Jimmy Carter sort of signed and stopped the arms race while they're in play, while the SALT treaties are, currently an issue, or then they don't allow, or they not necessarily don't allow, but it's both countries like promising not to participate in the arms race. But once they're not relevant anymore, once a president like withdraws from the treaty, then both countries like start building up weapons again. The Iranian hostage crisis, that was the one, that was another Jimmy Carter flop, where all of our employees at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran were taken hostage by Iranian student revolutionaries, and they took them hostage because they wanted the return of the Shah so that they could try him for war crimes and being a terrible leader, and probably you could assume that they were going to execute him. But Jimmy Carter offered him asylum since he had cancer, and so they take our people hostage, and they are hostage and held and tortured and abused for 444 days, and finally released in 1981. That's all of the major events in bold. I know I think I went a lot more in depth, especially in Jimmy Carter's presidency, talking about like the energy crisis and his all of the different things in his foreign policy. The book does talk about boycotting the Olympics, and I think it mentions the Camp David Accord. So those are definitely all things I covered in the notes, though. Does anybody have any questions before I let you go and I'll put your quiz live? No questions? Is it important to know that he gave away the Panama Canal? Of course, Caleb. That's probably the most important thing. That's why I'm going to run for president one day. Panama Canal. If that's a good example of his like whole philosophy on foreign policy, which is like we need to be good to people and be this benevolent nation and work with nations that respect human rights. So like us returning back ownership of this canal seemed like the right thing to do. So that's like very much Jimmy Carter, you know, to a T. Stagflation I went over at the beginning. Allie, rewind it. You said it was more relevant in this chapter. Yeah, that's why it's in this chapter. They talk about it in this chapter, not in the other chapter. Because stagflation's a 1970s issue. Other questions? It would be like getting 400 or getting almost 100 people held hostage for like over a year, and also getting good looking out Huxley, also getting the president of Egypt assassinated. Those would probably also be low points. Not happy about those, but definitely think bad giving away the Panama Canal. Not cool, Jimmy. Who do you think caused Kent State? Is this a conspiracy question, or are you asking me like literally National Guard or students? Or are you asking for me to say like the New World Order or something? College kids are stupid, and I think they made a lot of stupid mistakes. Throwing the tear gas canisters back at armed military, not a smart move. However, even throwing a tear gas canister back at like some, you know, an armed person, like that's not going to kill them. They get hit with it, like that will suck. But it's not, the intention of that is not murder. As soon as you discharge a firearm, your intention is to kill someone. So I think that the riot, in terms of all the weekend trauma, students calm down. But in terms of loss of life, National Guard didn't need to fire a weapon at that distance. You know, if I'm holding I'm not going to shoot them. I don't know. Maybe it depends on who it is. Do we need to know the Egyptian's present name? No. I don't know. I guess both sides are at fault. It's definitely, yeah. And a lot of you wrote that in your, the 60 side thing. A lot of you said that it was a mix of both, but you placed most of the responsibility on the National Guard. And that's definitely how I feel. See, exactly what you're saying. You know, the furthest shot 700 feet away, that person was not, their life was not in danger. So didn't take a side. Well, typical, trying to ride the middle. Sometimes you got to take a side. Okay. All right. So I'm going to call it. No more questions about any of this. I don't remember how many questions your quiz is, but it is one, you know, regular, one SAQ, and a bunch not. And I can't remember how long it is either. I made it like 2 days ago, and now I can't remember anything about the quiz, except for I do remember what the SAQ is, which I guess you will find out whenever you log on to take it. So if you felt comfortable with the review, go ahead and log in and start as soon as we're done with this. If you didn't feel so great about the review, if there are some things I mentioned that you're not sure of, you know, go back in and reread those parts of the chapter, look over your notes, listen to the videos at double speed. But remember that the quiz does have to be taken today. So get it done and good luck.